Hello everyone, my name is Vandana and I'm here today to talk to you guys about poetry and why it rocks, as you probably saw from the title of the video. So I've actually recently just gotten into poetry. I mean, I've always been kind of curious about it, but like recently I've been really getting into it. And I tell my friends this. I'm like, yeah, so I've been reading poetry recently, and they're like, oh wow, I don't really like poetry. And you know what? It's not shocking. It's not even surprising. I feel like a lot of people hate poetry, and it's not like your fault. It's not like you not liking poetry. I feel like, well, maybe some people genuinely don't, but even that is really hard to believe, especially when you hear my argument that I make in this video. But I think the reason why a lot of people think that they don't like poetry is because when we're first introduced to poetry, or really any literature in general, it's usually through school. And like math and science, they always have a very formulative structure in teaching poetry. They use complex words like iambic pentameter, and all of a sudden you're just like, what are we doing? Oh my god, I don't know what this is. And I don't blame you, because I wouldn't care about it either. Like, what, why? Like, they maybe go over a little bit about like the history of the author, whatever. At the end of the day, it might just not be something that interests you, which is totally fine. But that is maybe just like a little teeny tiny small square of like the graph paper that I feel like poetry is. Like, poetry, it's unlike other forms of like literature, like argumentative writing. There's a structure of what is considered a valid argument, what is considered sound, whatever. Even in storytelling, there is like this kind of like argument, or this story structure that is desired or whatever. But that's not the case with poetry. In poetry, to me at least, I feel like poetry is just the truest form of expression. It could be anything. It just really could be anything. But then, I guess you wonder, then, if poetry could be anything, what is considered good poetry? And that's a question that's been asked for ages. In an article published in 1918, which is really old, by Petronius Arbiter, very Hunger Games-esque name, I must say, this was like basically the exact question that was asked. And Arbiter was a guy who was very adamant of there being some kind of base definition or fundamental law that like governs what poetry is. And he argued that this law shouldn't restrict what poetry is, rather restrict the poet's license. And this was just basically the definition that he settled on. Poetry is an exalted state. Sorry, this is why I don't do poetry readings, because I know I'm gonna fucking stumble over my words and it's really annoying. But let's try to get through this definition, shall we? Poetry is an exalted emotional state of the soul, occasioned by the impact upon it of the facts and things of life and nature. A poem is an expression of thought and emotion in a written language of a more of less rhythmic form. And a poem is great in ratio of its power of stirring the highest emotions of the largest number of people for the longest period of time. I swear to you guys, I can read. I just am a little nervous today, but first YouTube video, be nice, be kind. Arbiter's article has a lot of very interesting viewpoints. For one, he mentions that aesthetics and even rhyme scheme is not necessarily necessary, there's a tongue twister, to create a meaningful poem. And he also mentions that a poem should add style and emotion to prose without like taking away meaning and like transforming it into like some flowery like la la lu la 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 la. It should still have meaning, is essentially what he was trying to say. And this is only one interpretation of what good poetry is. In another study that was conducted by Sandra Faulkner, who did qualitative interviews on 11 different poets, Many of the poets had argued that it was personal experience and the ability to transform that experience into something universal is what made a good poem a good poem. And these are just two definitions, both which I find really interesting, arbiters, because there's like this implication that everyone can kind of experience an exalted emotional state from reading a poem. But I do find that arbiter's definition like falls flat when you consider like the notion that what engages one person's soul may not kind of engage with another. And even the concept of the soul may seem kind of arbitrary to like a lot of you guys, but we're just gonna use that because I feel like it is like, to me, I feel like that is, it just makes the most sense. But I guess that's like basically my biggest issue with arbiter's argument though, is that there is this kind of pretentious nature of like what is considered poetry, and just generally people are just not going to agree with things. Maybe there may be like a general consensus of like, oh yeah, I think this is a good poem, but I feel like this shouldn't like take away from like others' opinion of what they consider to be a good poem, just because like it doesn't speak to a general, like a larger audience of people. Personally, if you ask me what makes a good poem, like a good poem is something that speaks to you, the individual. And while it is true that like a lot of poems, reinvent experience, I feel like even this definition limits exactly what poetry could be. Like, you guys, there is so much different types of poetry out there. Haikus, sonnets, free verse. Like, I could go on. And that's just like even like a tiny square on like the graph paper of what poetry is. It's funny we're saying graph paper, but like poetry's like written on like maybe line paper, so maybe like it's like a small line of the many lines in poetry. Okay, anyways, sometimes poems are even nonsensical, and arbiter's definition also limits this definition of what a poem is, because it's nonsensical. And I'd argue that even nonsense can speak to a person. And I'm going to be using the example of Lewis Carroll's Jabberwocky. And if it sounds familiar to you, that's because it was featured in Carroll's novel Through the Looking Glass, which is one of my favorite novels. So here's the poem. I don't know where I'm going to display it. Hopefully here. Yeah, let's just say here. I'm not going to read it because I'm probably going to stutter through it. So yeah, hopefully you read through it and you realize that these words have absolutely no meaning at all. And that's the fun of it. It is a nonsensical poem with no, I guess, real meaning or narrative, but it's up to each person to come up with their own interpretation of what the poem means to them. And that's fun. It's silly. It's definitely unique. And maybe this type of poetry doesn't speak to you, but it has spoken to a lot of people before, which is why it is considered like a classic kind of good poem and analyzed, because it just shows words are just like words, and different things speak to different people. People interpret things differently. And I think that's why it's a great example. Meaning, like, okay, if you are a person who likes Rupi Kaur, likes Instagram or like TikTok poets, don't let other people make you feel bad for enjoying something. Never let other people make you feel bad for enjoying something. Because like, if you enjoy a poem and it really speaks to you, that's all that matters. Like, of course you can critique a poem and you can explain why you don't like it and why it doesn't speak to you, but I feel like you should still be like kind of respectful about it. Like, people are just so mean to put down others on like what they consider poetry is, that it's just created such a terrible environment of like exploration. Like, how are we ever going to explore the bounds of poetry and the meaning and what we can do with it if we're so quick to knock down like everything? And I don't know. Maybe all I'm trying to say is like, let's just practice some etiquette. Of course, you can never ask that from the internet, but so yeah, this misinterpretation and attempt to lock up poetry into this little box is what's killing it. And I genuinely don't think that there would be a person out there who doesn't like poetry, and that's how confident I am. Like, I think that every person could find at least one poem if they searched really hard. Like, even lyrics, like from a song that you like. Like, maybe you listen to music just because you like the melody and the rhythm, which is fine. But you're telling me that there has never, ever in your life been like, maybe even a line, like a lyrical line that like stood out to you, that really resonated with you, that really spoke to you. Guess what? That's poetry. That is literally poetry, and you enjoy that. You can analyze that. You can look at it. You can like just ask yourself. I guess that's like the first step to like literary analysis, is just asking yourself, why do you enjoy this? What about this speaks to you? Even if it's like a Billie Eilish or a Mitski song, like just talk about it. Tell me what you like about it. And yeah, like right now I do kind of feel like one of those pastors who, try to make Jesus relatable by making references to pop culture. But you know what? It still stands. It's still, my point still stays, I feel. But yeah, guys, that's why I feel like poetry rocks, is because poetry has the ability to really connect with the individual. It like calls to you, it brings you in, it sometimes tells you a story, sometimes a perspective, sometimes history, and sometimes even like just a moral. But either way, there's just so much poetry could do for you. Even writing poetry, I feel like a lot of people are discouraged because like societal stereotypes that like label it as cringe and emo, which, you know, they're stereotypes, but and maybe they have roots, but who cares? Just express yourself. Like, you don't have to write for other people. You could just write for yourself. You can just use it as a creative outlet to like speak to yourself. And that is totally fine. Like, you don't have to be the next Keats. Like, you can just write for yourself. And maybe you're just sitting there and you're like, okay, well, poetry does all of this, but you know what else it does? TV, a good book, something else. Like, well, yeah, maybe you're right, but I really truly do feel like the feeling in general is just different. It's just something that you can't just describe. And it gets you to be more engaged, and it just feels personalized, because also like music is great because it's read to you. It's like it's poetry that's like being read to you in a certain melody, a certain like rhythm. But poetry is personalized. You are the one who's reading it, unless you're listening to it, which is also a fine choice if you're, if you want to get into it. But when you're reading poetry, you're the one who's kind of making the song in your head. And that's why it's, in my opinion, something more personal. So now that I've explained all this, maybe you're wondering, okay, maybe I'm a little bit more intrigued. How could I get into poetry? And to be honest, like as I said, I'm still kind of getting into it myself. One of the things that I really like to do is just I go into one poet, and I read a lot of their work, and then from there I kind of branch off into different poets. Maybe like I'll read an article and they'll be like, oh yeah, this poet is very similar to this poet, and then I'll read the works from that poet, and then I kind of just go like that. It's like that Wikipedia game where they just like go from one topic to like another topic, and it's like this whole little adventure, and it's fun. That's something that I kind of enjoy, but obviously not everyone's gonna want to do that. So another way you can just like kind of dip your little toe into the poetry pool is online websites. Me personally, I love the Poetry Foundation. There's not only a lot of like poems that you can just find for free, but like articles, really well written articles about topics or like certain poems that I also like really enjoy reading. Another thing you can do is also go to the library. They have lots of collections of poems, or you could also just buy the poetry book, which is a bit of an investment, and I understand why a lot of people would be kind of hesitant of spending money on like a poetry book, because you'd be like, there's no narrative here, like what am I getting it for? That's why I recommend like maybe at first going to a library, using online sources, and then kind of making an investment. But once you really get into it, a lot of people also subscribe to poetry magazines, which are a thing. I personally have yet to do that because I don't really have the funds for that yet, but there are a lot of different poetry magazines. I'll link a few in the, in the what's it called, bio. caption. I don't know. I'll link it below. These are nice though because they do give you a different like a lot of them give you like a variety of different poems and poets, so you just have like a lot to explore. It's like the universal yums or whatever of poetry. So that's like another thing that you could do. Of course, you could also just go on YouTube and listen to poetry readings, listen to some random person talk about poetry. Yeah, that's self-promo, guys. Next week or not next week, whenever I make the video, I'll be talking hopefully about Robert Frost and giving my 2 cents on him. And hopefully you guys will enjoy that. But yeah, if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, leave your comments, tell me what your favorite poem is or what your favorite song is. If you want me to talk about it, whatever. Tell me anything. All right, see you later, guys. That was it for today. Bye-bye.